Hi guys, thanks for coming back to join me to find out what happened in the next chapter of our adventure with Captain Bill, Trot, and the orc. We're on chapter 5, so we'll read chapter 5 and maybe chapter 6 today. It just depends on how long it is. I can't wait to see what they found out in this new land that they discovered after they went through that whole big tunnel. Chapter 5. Well, here's a picture of Captain Bill. The little old man of the island. A few steps brought them to the shed, which was merely a roof of boughs built over a square space with some branches of trees fastened to the sides to keep off the wind. The front was quite open and faced the sea, and as our friends came nearer, they observed a little man with a long pointed beard sitting motionless on a stool and staring thoughtfully out over the water. I guess I was wrong. That wasn't Captain Bill. That's a new character. "Get out of the way, please," he called in a fretful voice. "Can't you see you are obstructing my view?" "Good morning," said Captain Bill politely. "It isn't a good morning," snapped the little man. "I've seen plenty of mornings better than this. Do you call it a good morning when I'm pestered with such a crowd as you?" Trot was astonished to hear such words from a stranger when they had greeted quite properly, and Captain Bill grew red at the little man's rudeness. But the sailor said in a quiet tone of voice, "Are you the only one as lives on this here island?" "Your grammar's bad," said the little man. "But this is my own exclusive island, and I'll thank you to get off it as soon as possible." "We like to do that," said Trot, and then she and Captain Bill turned away and walked down to the shore to see if any other land was in sight. The little man rose and followed them, although both were now too provoked to pay any attention to him. "Nothing in sight, partner," reported Captain Bill, shading his eyes with his hand. "So we'll have to stay here for a time anyhow. It isn't a bad place, Trot, by any means." "That's all you know about it," broke in the little man. "The trees are altogether too green, and the rocks are harder than they ought to be. I find the sand very grainy and the water dreadfully wet. Every breeze makes a draught, and the sun shines in the daytime when there's no need of it, and disappears just as soon as it begins to get dark. If you remain here, you'll find an island very unsatisfactory." Trot turned to look at him as her sweet face was grave and curious. "I wonder who you are," she said. "My name is Pessum," said he with an air of pride. "I'm called the Observer." "Oh? What do you observe?" asked the little girl. "Everything I see," was the reply in a more surly tone. Then Pessum drew back with a startled exclamation and looked at some footprints in the sand. "Why, good gracious me!" he cried in distress. "What's the matter now?" asked Captain Bill. "Someone has pushed the earth in. Don't you see it?" "It isn't pushed in far enough to hurt anything," said Trot, examining the footprints. "Everything hurts that isn't right," insisted the man. "If the earth were pushed in a mile, it would be a great calamity, wouldn't it?" "I suppose so," admitted the little girl. "Well, here it is, pushed in a full inch. That's a 1/12 of a foot, or a little more than a millionth of part of a mile. Therefore, it is 1/millionth part of a calamity." "Oh dear, how dreadful," said Pessum in a wailing voice. That name Pessum kind of sounds like pessimistic. "Try to forget it, sir," advised Captain Bill soothingly. "It's beginning to rain. Let's get under your shed and keep dry." "Raining? Is it really raining?" said Pessum, beginning to weep. "It is," answered Captain Bill as the drops began to descend, "and I don't see any way to stop it, although I'm some observer myself." "No, we can't stop it, I fear," said the man. "Are you very busy just now?" "I won't be after I get to the shed," replied the sailor man. "Then do me a favor, please," begged Pessum, walking briskly along behind them, for they were hastening to the shed. "Depends what it is," said Captain Bill. "I wish you would take my umbrella down to the shore and hold it over the poor fishes till it stops raining. I'm afraid they'll all get wet." Trot laughed, but Captain Bill thought the little man was poking fun at him, and so he scowled upon Pessum in a way that showed he was angry. They reached the shed before getting very wet, although the rain was now coming down in big drops. The roof of the shed protected them, and while they stood watching the rainstorm, something buzzed in and circled around Pessum's head. At once the observer began beating it away with his hands and crying out, "A bumblebee, a bumblebee, the queerest bumblebee I ever saw!" Captain Bill and Trot both looked at it, and the little girl said in surprise, "Dear me, it's a wee little orc." That's what it is, sure enough, exclaimed Cap'n Bill. Really, it wasn't much bigger than a big bumblebee, and when it came toward Trot, she allowed it to light on her shoulder. It's me, all right, said a very small voice in her ear, but I'm afraid I'm awful pickled just the same. What? You're our orc, then? Demanded the little girl, much amazed. No, I'm my own orc, but I'm the only orc you know, replied the tiny creature. What's happened to you? Asked the sailor, putting his hand close to Trot's shoulder in order to hear the reply. Possum also put his hand close, and the orc said, You will remember that when I left you, I started to fly over the trees, and just as I got to this side of the forest, I saw a bush that was loaded down with the most luscious fruit you can imagine. The fruit was about the size of a gooseberry and of a lovely lavender color, so I swooped down and picked one off my bill and ate it. At once I began to grow small. I could feel myself shrinking and shrinking away, and it frightened me terribly, so that I alighted on the ground to think over what was happening. In a few seconds I had shrunk to the size you see me now, but there I remained, getting no smaller, indeed, but no larger. It is certainly a dreadful affliction. After I had recovered somewhat from the shock, I began to search for you. It is not easy to find one's way when a creature is so small, but fortunately I spied you here in this shed and came to you at once. Oh, look. Here's the little orc coming to see Trot. Look how tiny he is now. Okay. Cap'n Bill and Trot were much astonished at this story and felt grieved for the poor orc, but the little man Possum seemed to think it a good joke. He began laughing when he heard the story and laughed until he choked, after which he lay down on the ground and rolled and laughed again while the tears of merriment coursed down his wrinkled cheeks. Oh dear, he finally gasped, sitting up and wiping his eyes. This is too rich. It's almost too joyful to be true. I don't see anything funny about it, remarked Trot indignantly. You would if you had my experience, said the possum, getting up on his feet and gradually resuming his solemn and dissatisfied expression of countenance. The same thing happened to me. Oh, it did? And how did you happen to come to this island? Asked the girl. I didn't come. The neighbors brought me, replied the little man with a frown at the recollection. They said I was quarrelsome and fault-finding and blamed me because I told them all the things that went wrong or never were right, and because I told them how things ought to be. So they brought me here and left me all alone, saying that if I quarreled with myself, no one else would be unhappy. Absurd, wasn't it? Seems to me, said Cap'n Bill, those neighbors did the proper thing. Well, resumed Possum, when I found myself king of this island, I was obliged to live upon fruits, and I found many fruits growing here that I had never seen before. I tasted several and found them good and wholesome, but one day I ate a lavender berry, as the orc did, and immediately I grew so small that I was scarcely 2 inches high. It was a very unpleasant condition, and like the orc, I became frightened. I could not walk very well, nor very far, for every lump of earth in my way seemed a mountain, every blade of grass a tree, and every grain of sand a rocky boulder. For several days I stumbled around in an agony of fear. Once a tree toad nearly gobbled me up, and if I ran out from the shelter of the bushes, the gulls and cormorants swooped down upon me. Finally, I decided to eat another berry and became nothing at all, and since life too, one as small as I was, had become a dreary nightmare. At last I found a small tree that bore the same fruit as that I had eaten. The berry was dark purple instead of light lavender, but otherwise it was quite similar. Being unable to climb the tree, I was obliged to wait underneath it until a sharp breeze arose and shook the limbs so that a berry fell. Instantly I seized it, and taking the last view of the world as I then thought, I ate the berry in a twinkling. Then, to my surprise, I began to grow big again until I became my former stature. So I have since remained. Needless to say, I have never eaten again of the lavender fruit, nor do any of the beasts or birds that live upon the island eat it. They had all three listened eagerly to this amazing tale, and when it was finished, the orc exclaimed, Do you think, then, that the deep purple berry is the antidote for the lavender one? I'm sure of it, answered Possum. Then lead me to the tree at once, begged the orc, for this tiny form I now have terrifies me greatly. Oh, Look, there's a frog that was about to eat Possum when he was small and tiny. You are ugly enough as you are, said he. Were you any larger, you might be dangerous. Oh, no, Trot assured him. The orc has been our good friend. Please take us to the tree. Then Possum consented, although rather reluctantly. He led them to the right, which was to the east side of the island, and in a few minutes brought them near the edge of the grove, which faced the shore of the ocean. Here stood a small tree bearing berries of a deep purple color. The fruit looked very enticing, and Cap'n Bill reached up and selected one that seemed especially plump and ripe. The orc had remained perched upon Trot's shoulder, but now it flew down to the ground. It was so difficult for Cap'n Bill to kneel down with his wooden leg that the little girl took the berry from him and held it close to the orc's head. It's too big to go into my mouth, said the little creature, looking at the fruit sideways. You'll have to make several mouthfuls of it, I guess, said Trot. That is what the orc did. He pecked at the soft, ripe fruit with his bill and ate it up very quickly because it was good. Even before he had finished the berry, they could see the orc begin to grow. In a few minutes, he had regained his natural size and was strutting before them, quite delighted with his transformation. Well, well, what do you think of me now? He asked proudly. You are very skinny and remarkably ugly, declared Possum. You are a poor judge of orcs, was the reply. Anyone can see that I'm much handsomer than those dreadful things called birds, which are all fluff and feathers. Their feathers make soft beds, asserted Possum. And my skin would make an excellent drumhead, retorted the orc. Nevertheless, a plucked bird or a skinned orc would be of no value to himself, so we needn't brag on our usefulness after we are dead. But for the sake of argument, friend Possum, I'd like to know what good you would be were you not alive. Never mind that, said Cap'n Bill. He isn't much good as he is. I am the king of this island. Allow me to say, and you're intruding on my property, declared the little man, scowling upon them. If you don't like me, and I'm sure you don't, for no one else does, why don't you go away and leave me to myself? Well, the orc can fly, but we can't, explained Trot in answer. We don't want to stay here a bit, but I don't see how we can get away. You can go back into the hole you came from, Cap'n Bill shook his head. Trot shuddered at the thought. The orc laughed out loud. You may be the king here, the creature said to Possum, but we intend to run this island to suit ourselves, for we are three and you are one, and the balance of power lies with us. The little man made no reply to this, although as they walked back to the shed, his face wore its fiercest scowl. Cap'n Bill gathered a lot of leaves and, assisted by Trot, prepared 2 nice beds in the opposite corners of the shed. Possum slept in a hammock which she swung between 2 trees. They required no dishes, as all their food consisted of fruits and nuts picked from the trees. They made no fire, for the weather was warm and there was nothing to cook. The shed had no furniture other than the rude stool which the little man was accustomed to sit upon. He called it his throne, and they let him keep it. So they lived upon the island for 3 days and rested and ate to their heart's content. Still, they were not at all happy in this life because of Possum. He continually found fault with them in all that they did, in all their surroundings. He could see nothing good or admirable in the world, and Trot soon came to understand why the little man's former neighbors had brought him to this island and left him there all alone so that he could not annoy anyone. It was their misfortune that they had been led to this place by their adventures, for often they would have preferred the company of a wild beast to that of Possum. On the 4th day, a happy thought came to the orc. They had all been racking their brains for a possible way to leave the island and discussing this or that method without finding a plan that was practical. Cap'n Bill said he could make a raft of the trees big enough to float them all, but he had no tools except for those 2 pocket knives, and it was not possible to chop down trees with such a small blade. And suppose we got a float of the ocean, said Trot. Where would we drift to, and how long would it take us to get there? Cap'n Bill was forced to admit he didn't know. The orc could fly away from the island at any time it wished, but the queer creature was loyal to his new friends and refused to leave them in such a lonely, forsaken place. It was when Trot urged him to go on this 4th morning that the orc had this happy thought. I will go, said he, if you 2 will agree to ride upon my back. We are too heavy. You might drop us, objected Captain Bill. Yes, you are rather heavy for a long journey, acknowledged the orc, but you might eat of those lavender berries and become so small that I could carry you with ease. This quaint suggestion startled Trot, and she looked gravely at the speaker while she considered it, but Cap'n Bill gave a scornful snort and asked, "What would become of us afterward? We wouldn't be much good if you were some 2 or 3 inches high. No, Mr. Orc, I'd rather stay here as I am than be hopping my thumb somewhere else." "Why couldn't you take some of the dark purple berries along with you to eat after we had reached our destination?" inquired the orc. "Then you could grow big again whenever you pleased." Trot clapped her hands with delight. "That's it," she exclaimed. "Let's do it, Cap'n Bill." The old sailor did not like the idea at first, but he thought it over carefully, and the more he thought, the better it seemed. "How could you manage to carry us if we were so small?" he asked. "I could put you in a paper bag and tie the bag around my neck." "But we haven't a paper bag," objected Trot. The orc looked at her. "There's your sunbonnet," he said presently, "which is hollow in the middle and has 2 strings that you could tie around my neck." Look at the orc. He's quite happy with himself. Trot took off her sunbonnet and regarded it critically. Yes, it might easily hold both her and Cap'n Bill after they had eaten the lavender berries and been reduced in size. She tried the strings around the orc's neck, and the sunbonnet made a bag in which 2 tiny people might ride without danger of falling out. So she said, "I believe we'll do it that way, Cap'n." Cap'n Bill groaned, but could make no logical objection except the plan seemed to him quite dangerous in more ways than one. "I think so myself," said Trot soberly, "but nobody can stay alive without getting into danger sometimes, and danger doesn't mean getting hurt, Captain. It only means we might get hurt, so I guess we'll have to take that risk." "Let's go find the berries," said the orc. They said nothing to Pessum, who was sitting on his stool and scowling dismally as he stared at the ocean, but stared at it once to seek the trees and bore the magic fruits. The orc remembered very well where the lavender berries grew and led his companions quickly to the spot. Cap'n Bill gathered 2 berries and placed them carefully in his pocket. Then they went around to the east side of the island and found the trees that bore the dark purple berries. "I guess I'll take 4 of these," said the sailor, "so in case one doesn't make us grow big, we can eat another." "Better take 6, advised the orc. "It's well to be on the safe side, and I'm sure those trees grow nowhere else in all the world." So Cap'n Bill gathered 6 of the purple berries with their precious fruit, and they returned to the shed to bid goodbye to Possum. Perhaps they would not have granted the surly little man this courtesy had they not wished to use him to tie the sunbonnet around the orc's neck. And that was good thinking ahead of time. When Pessum learned that they were about to leave him, he at first looked greatly pleased, but he suddenly recollected that nothing ought to please him, and so began to grumble about being left alone. "We knew it wouldn't suit you," remarked Cap'n Bill. "It didn't suit you to have us here, and it won't suit you to have us leave." "That is quite true," admitted Pessum. "I haven't been suited since I can remember, so it doesn't matter to me in the least whether you go or stay." He was interested in their experiment, however, and willingly agreed to assist, although he prophesied they would fall out of the sunbonnet on their way and be either drowned in the ocean or crushed upon some rocky shore. This uncheerful prospect did not daunt Trot, but it made Cap'n Bill nervous. "I will eat my berry first," said Trot as she placed the sunbonnet on the ground in such a manner that they could get into it. Then she ate the lavender berry, and in a few seconds became so small that Cap'n Bill picked her up and gently with his thumb and 1 finger and placed her in the middle of the sunbonnet. Then he placed beside her the 6 purple berries, each one being about as big as a tiny Trot's head. And all the preparations being now made, the older sailor ate his lavender berry and became very small, wooden leg and all. Oh, that was a good thing. Cap'n Bill stumbled sadly in, trying to climb over the edge of the sunbonnet, and pitched in beside Trot, head first, which caused the unhappy Pessum to laugh with glee. Then the king of the island picked up the sunbonnet so rudely that he shook his occupants like peas in the pod and tied it by means of strings securely around the orc's neck. "I hope, Trot, you sewed those strings on tight," said Cap'n Bill anxiously. "Why, we are not very heavy, you know," she replied, "so I think the stitches will hold. But be careful and not crush the berries, Cap'n." "One is jammed already," he said, looking at them. "Already?" asked the orc. "Yes," they cried together, and Pessum came close to the sunbonnet and called out to them, "You'll be smashed or drowned, I'm sure you will, but farewell and good riddance to you." The orc was provoked by this unkind speech, so he turned his tail toward the little man and made it revolve so fast that the rush of air tumbled Pessum over backward, and he rolled several times upon the ground before he could stop himself and sit up. By the time the orc was high in the air and speeding swiftly over the ocean. There's Trot. She turned so tiny she fit right in Cap'n Bill's palm of his hand. Chapter 6. I think we should keep going and see if we can find out where they landed. Here's Cap'n Bill and Trot inside of the bonnet. The flight of the midgets. Cap'n Bill and Trot rode very comfortably in the sunbonnet. The motion was quite steady, for they weighed so little that the orc flew without effort. Yet they were both somewhat nervous about their future fate and could not help wishing they were safe on land and their natural size again. "You're terrible small, Trot," remarked Cap'n Bill, looking at his companion. "Same to you, Captain," she said with a laugh, "but as long as we have the purple berries, we needn't worry about our size." "In a circus," mused the old man, "we'd be curiosities, but in a sunbonnet, high in the air, sailing over the big unknown ocean, there ain't no word in any dictionary to describe us." "Why, we're midgets, that's all," said the little girl. The orc flew silently for a long time. The slight swaying of the sunbonnet made Cap'n Bill drowsy, and he began to doze. Trot, however, was wide awake, and after enduring the monotonous journey as long as she was able to, she called out, "Don't you see land anywhere, Mr. Orc?" "Not yet," he answered. "This is a big ocean, and I have no idea in which direction the nearest land to the island lies. But if I keep flying in a straight line, I'm sure to reach someplace sometime." That seemed reasonable, so the little people in the sunbonnet remained as patient as possible. And that is, Cap'n Bill dozed, and Trot tried to remember her geography lessons so she could figure out what land they were likely to arrive at. For hours and hours, the orc flew steadily, keeping to the straight line and searching with his eyes the horizons of the ocean for land. Cap'n Bill was fast asleep and snoring, and Trot had laid her head on his shoulder to rest it when suddenly the orc exclaimed, "There! I've caught a glimpse of land at last." There's Cap'n Bill and Trot peeking out from the sunbonnet. At this announcement, they roused themselves. Cap'n Bill stood up and tried to peek over the edge of the sunbonnet. "What does it look like?" he inquired. "It looks like another island," said the orc, "but I can judge it better in a minute or two." "I don't care much for islands since we visited that other one," declared Trot. Soon the orc made another announcement. "It is surely an island, and a little one too," said he, "but I won't stop because I see a much bigger land straight ahead of it." "That's right," approved Cap'n Bill. "The bigger the land, the better it will suit us." "It's almost a continent," continued the orc after a brief silence during which he did not decrease the speed of his flight. "I wonder if it can be Orkland, the place I have been seeking so long." "I hope not," whispered Trot to Cap'n Bill so softly that the orc could not hear her, "for I shouldn't like to be in the country where only orcs live. This one orc isn't a bad companion, but a lot of him wouldn't be much fun." After a few more minutes of flying, the orc called out in a sad voice, "No, this is not my country. It's a place I have never seen before, although I have wandered far and wide. It seems to be all mountains and deserts, green valleys and queer cities, and lakes and rivers mixed up in the very puzzling way." "Most countries are like that," it commented Cap'n Bill. "Are you going to land?" "Pretty soon," was the reply. "There is a mountain peak just ahead of me. What do you say to our landing on that? All right, agreed the sailor man, for both he and Trot were getting tired of riding in the sunbonnet and longed to set foot on solid ground again. So in a few minutes, the orc slowed down his speed and then came to a stop so easily that they were scarcely jarred at all. Then the creature squatted down until the sunbonnet rested on the ground and began trying to unfasten with its claws the knotted strings. This proved a very clumsy task because the strings were tied at the back of the orc's neck, just where his claws could not easily reach. After much fumbling, he said, "I'm afraid I can't let you out, and there is no one near to help me." This was at first discouraging, but after a little thought, Captain Bill said, "If you don't mind, Trot, I can cut a slit in your sunbonnet with my knife." "Do," she replied. "The slit won't matter, because I can sew it up again afterwards when I am big." So Captain Bill got out his knife, which was just as small in proportion as he was, and after considerable trouble managed to cut a long slit in the sunbonnet. First he squeezed through the opening himself, and then helped Trot to get out. When they stood on firm ground again, their first act was to begin eating the dark purple berries which they had brought with them. Two of these Trot had guarded carefully during the long journey by holding them on her lap for their safety, which meant much to the tiny people. "I am not very hungry," said the little girl as she handed a berry to Captain Bill, "but hunger doesn't count in this case. It's like taking medicine to make you well, so we must manage to eat them somehow or another." But the berries proved quite pleasant to the taste. As Captain Bill and Trot nibbled on their edges, their forms began to grow in size, slowly but steadily. Bigger they grew, the easier it was for them to eat the berries, which of course became smaller to them, and by the time the fruit was eaten, our friends had regained their natural size. Oh, that's lucky, isn't it? The little girl was greatly relieved when she found herself as large as she had ever been, and Captain Bill shared her satisfaction, for although they had seen the effect of the berries on the orc, they had not been sure the magic fruit would have the same effect on human beings, or that the magic would work in any other country than that in which the berries grew. Ooh, we didn't think of that. "What shall we do with the other 4 berries?" asked Trot as she picked up her sunbonnet, marveling that she had ever been small enough to ride in it. "They're no good to us now, are they, Captain?" "I'm not sure as to that," he replied. "If they were eaten by one who had never eaten the lavender berries, they might have no effect at all. But then contrariwise they might. One of them has to go badly jammed, so I'll throw it away. But the other 3, I believe, I'll carry with me. They're magic things, you know, and may come in handy to us at some time." He now searched in his big pockets and drew out a small wooden box with a sliding cover. The sailor had kept an assortment of nails of various sizes in the box, but those he now dumped loosely into his pocket, and in the box placed the 3 sound purple berries. When this important matter was attended to, they found time to look about them and see what sort of place the orc had landed them in. There's Captain Bill with the berries in his hand. Well, friends, that ends chapter 6. So I think we'll quit here and we'll come back tomorrow for chapter 7 and find out where Trot and Captain Bill landed with the orc, what kind of a magical country they're in, and what kind of adventures they'll have next. So I hope you'll join me here tomorrow night. Have a good night.